Dean Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly.
In 2007, Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Kuznetsov, a 34-year-old officer in the tax crimes unit of the Moscow Interior Ministry, along with a group of Russian officials, police officers, and organized criminals, stole $230 million from the Russian people. It was the biggest tax fraud in Russia's history and resulted in the death of Sergei Magnitsky. Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Kuznetsov played a key role in the tax fraud conspiracy and in the death of Sergei Magnitsky. Jameson Firestone is founder and managing partner of the Moscow-based law firm Firestone Duncan and has been acting for clients in Russia since 1993.
It all began in 2007 when Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Kuznetsov from the Ministry of Internal Affairs led 2 raids in Moscow to confiscate the documents of 3 companies that belonged to Hermitage Fund. Within months of those documents being in the possession of the Ministry of Interior, they were used to change the owner and director of the Hermitage companies to a convicted killer, Viktor Markelov. And then the companies applied for a fraudulent $230 million tax refund, which they received in 1 day. In October of 2008, my colleague Sergei Magnitsky, who managed the tax and audit department of my Moscow law firm Firestone Duncan, discovered the fraud. He gave official witness testimony against Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov and his colleague Major Pavel Karpov. He detailed how they were involved in the theft of the $230 million. Within 1 month of Sergei testifying against the officers, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov had Sergei arrested. Once Sergei had been detained, he was refused bail. They held him in prison for a year, and he was subjected to incredible psychological and physical pressure, torture in prison, to retract his testimony against the officers, Kuznetsov and Karpov, which he refused to do.
While Sergei was being tortured and pressured to withdraw his claims that Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov aided the $230 million theft, the Kuznetsov family became rich. According to the records of the Unified State Register of Real Estate Rights, since 2007, the Kuznetsov family has acquired real estate in and around Moscow worth over $3 million. This is all registered to his pensioner parents, who each receive a monthly pension of $180, and who, according to bank records, have a total combined income of $4,500 per month. In 2007, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov's mother, Lilia Georgievna, became the registered owner of an exclusive 155-square-meter condominium in the prestigious new Edelweiss high-rise in Moscow. The apartment is just off Kutuzovsky Prospect, with views over Park Pobedi, and has a market price of $1,640,000. Shortly after this, in 2008, the Kuznetsov family acquired another apartment, this time registered to Kuznetsov's father, Konstantin Artyomovich. This 85-square-meter condominium is in Moscow's impressive new development, the Capital Constellation Tower. The apartment has a market value of close to $1 million. These 2 new apartments, registered to Kuznetsov's parents, are in addition to the 3-room apartment in Moscow that they acquired in 1994 and still own. The Kuznetsov family also acquired land plots in the countryside in the Pushkino village, Noginsky district, just outside Moscow. These 3 land plots are registered to Kuznetsov's mother. The total market value of the 4,700 square meters of land registered in her name is $198,000. With their combined income, it would take Kuznetsov's parents 52 years to pay for all this real estate. Or for Kuznetsov, 295 years of his official Interior Ministry wage. And it wasn't just real estate that they bought. According to the records of Moscow's traffic police, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov's mother bought the latest model Land Rover Freelander 2 for $65,000. Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov's wife Nina purchased a brand new top-of-the-range Land Rover which cost $131,000. She also became the owner of a brand new Mercedes-Benz SLK 200 convertible, which cost an additional $81,000. Since the theft of the $230 million, the total value of purchases made by the Kuznetsov family, identified in official records, was over $3 million. Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov would have to work for 322 years to be able to afford such an opulent lifestyle. While the Kuznetsov family was acquiring vehicles and properties, Sergei Magnitsky was being abused in prison by Kuznetsov's colleagues. His captors tried to force him to withdraw his testimony about Kuznetsov and Karpov's involvement in the theft, and to bully him into a false confession to justify his arrest and detention. When Sergei refused, they tortured him.
Sergei kept a diary while in prison describing the conditions that he was subjected to. He was put into a cell with 8 prisoners, 4 beds, lights on 24 hours a day, no glass in the windows, and no heat. People had to sleep in shifts. They couldn't sleep, and they were freezing all of the time. Then he was moved from cell to cell, each time losing all his belongings along the way. Then he was put into a cell that was flooded with sewerage, where it was impossible to move unless you were jumping from bed to bed. He was denied access to showers, to clean water. The hygiene conditions were absolutely impossible. And he was consistently refused meetings with his family. He was even refused telephone calls with his children. He sat 11 months in detention and died never hearing the voices of his children again. Sergei's health began to break down. He lost 40 pounds, and he was in constant pain. He was diagnosed in prison with pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, and he made hundreds of requests for medical care. But the officers involved denied his requests for medical care as a means of increasing the pressure on him to change his testimony.
From the time of the theft, and while Sergei Magnitsky was slowly dying, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov was living a very different kind of life. According to Border Service Control records, he traveled the globe in style. He went to Dubai. He celebrated the New Year in Cuba and spent 3 weeks in France. He made 3 trips to Italy, including a 3-week driving tour of the country with his wife. He visited London. He flew to Cyprus by private jet, where he and his wife stayed in the 5-star Londa Hotel. Kuznetsov's bill, just for extras, drinks, massages and pay-per-view, came to 1,240 euros. This bill alone, without the private jet and hotel room, is equivalent to almost 2 months of his official salary at the Interior Ministry. During this period, while Sergei Magnitsky experienced the confinement of a prison cell, he logged over 450 official complaints. On October 13th, 2009, Sergei once again made a statement from prison detailing Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov's complicity in the theft of $230 million from the Russian people. He also detailed how his conditions worsened every time he refused to withdraw his testimony against Kuznetsov and his fellow officers. 1 month later, after being tortured for 11 months and denied all access to medical care, his body finally gave out. On the 16th of November, in excruciating pain and screaming for a doctor, he was put into a straitjacket and locked in a room for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he was dead. After Sergei Magnitsky died, the Moscow Public Oversight Committee carried out a full investigation into Sergei's death. Panel member Zoya Svetova said this was an intentional death. Andrei Babushkin, another panel member, said that Sergei Magnitsky was murdered to conceal the fraud he had exposed.
Sergei stood up to corruption. Sergei stood up to evil. Sergei believed that to make this country a decent place for our children, for ourselves, that we had to fight these things. And Sergei died a hero, and it's time we recognize that.
If this war on legal nihilism is to succeed, the government must support the people who fight corruption. The officers responsible for the arrest and death of Sergei Magnitsky must be punished. Instead of being prosecuted, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov was given a major promotion from the Moscow City Tax Crimes Office to the Federal Department of Economic Security. 3 years before Sergei died, the same officers, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov and Major Karpov, acting with the same convicted killer, Viktor Markelov, were accused of kidnapping Fyodor Mikheyev in 2006 with an attempt to extort $20 million. To cover up their crime, they sent Fyodor Mikheyev to prison for 11 years, where he is to this day. They should have been stopped then. Instead, they went on to arrest, torture, and kill Sergei Magnitsky to hide their crimes. Crimes that they committed against their own government and the people they were sworn to protect. Unless they are stopped, the same criminal group will continue to steal, murder, and cover up their crimes. Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov uses his position to steal and destroy lives. He's become a very rich man and believes his uniform makes him untouchable. It's time to prove him wrong. Russia deserves better. Major Pavel Karpov, a 32-year-old officer in the main investigation unit of the Moscow Interior Ministry, played a key role in defrauding the Russian people of $230 million and in the cover-up which led to the death of Sergei Magnitsky. In June 2007, government officials raided 2 offices in Moscow. They seized documents and seals belonging to 3 Hermitage Fund companies and put them in the custody of Major Pavel Karpov. While the documents and seals were in the custody of Major Karpov, they were used to re-register ownership and control of the companies to a convicted killer, Viktor Markelov. The criminals then applied for a fraudulent $230 million tax refund, which they received in just 1 day.
This was the largest tax fraud in Russian history, and my friend and colleague Sergei Magnitsky decided to do something about it. In October of 2008, Sergei Magnitsky gave official witness testimony against Major Pavel Karpov and his colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov. He detailed how they were involved in the theft of the $230 million. Within 1 month of Sergei giving his witness testimony, he was arrested by the same officers who he had testified against. Sergei was held in prison for 11 months in torturous conditions where physical and psychological pressure was applied to him constantly. But whatever Major Karpov and his associates did to Sergei, he refused to withdraw his testimony against the officers.
While Sergei Magnitsky was being tortured, Major Karpov lived a life of luxury that was far beyond his official monthly salary of $535. While Sergei lost 40 pounds and was left to die, Major Karpov was enjoying Moscow's finest restaurants. Major Karpov and his friends were wining and dining the most beautiful girls in Moscow and enjoying all that the Moscow nightlife has to offer. Major Karpov was even using prisons for fun, arranging for a friend's wedding reception to be held in a prison cell at 13 Bolshaya Znamenka. Major Karpov wasn't just having fun, he and his family were acquiring serious wealth. According to the records of the Unified State Register of Real Estate Rights, in November 2008, after the proceeds of the fraud had been collected, Major Karpov's 61-year-old pensioner mother, Nadezhda Fedorovna, became the registered owner of a new apartment in the prestigious Shuvalovsky high-rise by Metro Universitet in Moscow. This condominium has a market value of $930,000, approximately 145 years' worth of Major Karpov's official salary, or 153 years' worth of his mother's reported income. This condominium is in addition to a 3-bedroom apartment at Balaklavsky Prospect in Moscow that she privatized and continues to own. In October 2007, shortly after the officers seized the Hermitage materials, she also became the registered owner of 2 land plots in the upmarket Narofominsky region outside Moscow. Each plot is 1,500 square meters with a combined market value of $120,000. According to the records of the Moscow Traffic Police, Major Karpov's pensioner mother also became the owner of a brand new Audi A3 costing $47,000 and a second-hand 200-mile-an-hour Porsche 911 Carrera for $41,000. On paper, she lives an opulent life, considering she reported a monthly income of $505. Major Karpov bought a Mercedes-Benz E-Class 280 for $72,601. He purchased it with a $60,906 car loan and declared a salary of $535 per month. He would have needed to save his entire declared salary for 10 years to buy it. Despite his declared income, he paid off the entire loan in 1 year. He also drives a top-of-the-range Porsche Cayenne to his Interior Ministry assignments. It has a retail price of $126,300. Following the fraud, the Karpov family became at least $1.3 million better off. While Sergei Magnitsky was confined to a dark cell, freezing because his cell had no heat and no window panes. While he was held captive in a cell flooded with sewage. While he was screaming in agony and begging for help, Major Karpov was traveling the world in luxury. According to passport control records, he took 8 vacations in just 1 year. He traveled to Great Britain, the United States, and Italy. He vacationed for 2 weeks in the Caribbean. He toured Spain from Madrid to Barcelona. He went sightseeing in Vienna and sunbathing in the Greek islands. He experienced Middle Eastern culture in Oman. He flew to Cyprus twice, and he returned to his favorite destination, Turkey, 6 times, as well as enjoying several trips to Dubai. On the 13th of October 2009, Sergei Magnitsky gave the following testimony from prison.
The criminal proceeding against me is an act of repression to punish me for assisting my client with the investigation of the theft of their 3 companies. In the course of providing legal assistance to my client, it became known to me that Russian Interior Ministry officials may be complicit in the theft of the companies and that the stolen companies were used by the perpetrators to steal from the state budget 5.4 billion rubles.
Sergei was held for 11 months in prison under torturous conditions. They moved him to cells that had no hygiene, with holes in the floor for toilets. They turned off the hot water to his cells and denied him showers. They prevented him from even boiling water so that you could drink clean water in the prison. They refused him medical care. He got sicker and sicker, and he refused to withdraw his testimony. On November 16th of 2009, this 37-year-old man who went to prison healthy died. Sergei died alone and in extreme pain in prison. When he called for doctors, screaming in pain, he was put in a straitjacket. He was transferred to another prison facility and thrown into a cell alone. The door was closed and he was left alone for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he died, all the while with a medical team on the other side of the door. He left a wife, a mother, and 2 children. 2 children who he had not been allowed to speak to even once for the entire year that he was held in police custody.
After Sergei Magnitsky's death, Ludmila Alexeyeva, chairperson of the Russian Helsinki Commission of Human Rights, filed a criminal complaint saying that his death was not accidental. It did not occur as merely oversight or negligence of some particular prison officials. Mr. Sergei Magnitsky died from regular tortures that were willfully applied by officers of the Interior Ministry. U.S. Senator Benjamin Cardin has published a list of the officials involved and the crimes they committed, and called for the US and Europe to refuse visas for all the officers involved in the false arrest and murder of Sergei Magnitsky. Despite public demand for justice, Major Karpov has not been punished. Following Sergei's death, Major Karpov received a significant promotion and moved from the Moscow Interior Ministry to the Investigation Committee of the Federal Interior Ministry. Sergei Magnitsky was not Major Karpov's first victim. According to criminal case files from the Russian Interior Ministry, in 2006, Major Karpov, Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov, and the convicted killer Viktor Markelov kidnapped Fyodor Mikheyev and attempted to extort $20 million. Markelov was briefly detained, but the officers managed to escape prosecution and quickly used their positions to free him. As in the Magnitsky case, Major Karpov and Lieutenant Colonel Kuznetsov then used their positions to imprison the man who had testified against them. Fyodor Mikheyev, the man they had kidnapped and who was brave enough to testify against them, was sent to prison for 11 years, where he is to this day. 2 years later, after Sergei Magnitsky testified against the same criminal group for an even larger crime, the same officers arrested, tortured, and eventually killed Sergei to hide their crime. Unless they're stopped, the same criminal group will continue to murder and steal. It's time for the Russian government to prosecute the officers responsible for the arrest and death of Sergei Magnitsky. Major Pavel Karpov uses his position to steal, destroy lives. He's become a very rich man and believes his uniform makes him untouchable. It's time to prove him wrong. Russia deserves better. On Christmas Eve 2007, while families were finishing their holiday shopping, the employees of Moscow tax authorities number 25 and 28 were working late into the night to pay out a $230 million fraudulent tax refund. This was the largest fraudulent tax refund in Russian history, and it was approved in one day, on Christmas Eve, and paid out with no questions asked.
The refund was made to 3 companies that police officers working with organized criminals stole from my client, the Hermitage Fund, in the summer and fall of 2007. And my client, the Hermitage Fund, discovered the theft and reported it 3 weeks before the refund was made. But law enforcement chose to do nothing and allowed the theft to continue.
The thief, who the criminal group made owner and director of the stolen companies and who applied for the $230 million tax refund, was a convicted killer, Viktor Markelov. The stolen money was paid to accounts in the Universal Savings Bank, a small bank owned by another convicted criminal, Dmitry Kluyev. Previous episodes of Russian Untouchables showed how Interior Ministry officer Lieutenant Colonel Artem Kuznetsov became $3 million richer at the time of the theft, and how Major Pavel Karpov became $1.3 million richer after the crime. Today, we're going to show you how officials in Moscow Tax Office number 28 and their families became $43 million richer after their office approved fraudulent tax refunds uncovered by Sergei Magnitsky.
Sergei discovered the theft in progress, and he reported it 3 weeks before any refunds were made. And he named all the criminals and police officers involved and testified against these people. Very shortly thereafter, officers Kuznetsov and Karpov had Sergei arrested. He was tortured in prison, and he died at age 37, leaving a wife and 2 children behind. All of the officers involved in this were promoted, and they were all given medals for being Russia's best investigators. One day before the anniversary of Sergei's death, the MVD called a press conference to announce their preliminary findings. Their press spokeswoman, Irina Dudukina, announced that the tax officials who returned this huge sum of money in 24 hours are all innocent. They were just tricked, and she tried to blame the entire crime on Sergei Magnitsky, the man who reported it. Since Sergei's death, we've been overwhelmed by people just providing us with information on the officers involved. Today we're going to share with you some of the information that the public has provided and how the tax officials involved became enormously wealthy.
Meet Olga Stepanova, the 46-year-old head of Moscow Tax Office number 28. She's married to Vladin Stepanov, who's a 46-year-old employee of the construction company Volstroy. According to the Russian tax returns filed by Olga Stepanova and Vladlen Stepanov between 2006 and 2009, their average annual income was $38,381 per annum. However, their tax returns don't show the millions of dollars they made from the crime that Sergei discovered and that they hid in Swiss banks. According to Cypriot company ownership records, on January the 26th, 2008, 1 month after his wife authorized the majority of the fraudulent $230 million tax refund, Vladlen Stepanov incorporated a new Cyprus company named Arivast Holdings Limited. Mr. Stepanov then opened a bank account for his company with Credit Suisse Zurich. Bank statements from Credit Suisse show that in less than a month, 5 transfers totaling 7.1 million euros were sent to the company owned by Mr. Stepanov. According to legal documents from the British Virgin Islands, Vladlen Stepanov set up a second company, Ikete Properties Incorporated. This company also opened accounts with Credit Suisse Zurich. Bank statements show 3 incoming transfers totaling 750,000 euros and 2 more incoming transfers totaling $650,000. These 2 offshore companies owned by Mr. Stepanov received the equivalent of $11 million. The amount the Stepanovs received in just these 2 companies as a result of the fraudulent tax refunds is 287 times greater than the income they declared for the same time period in their official income tax returns. In addition to the money they received offshore, they received huge amounts of undeclared cash in Russia as well, allowing them to live a truly lavish life inside of Russia. They commissioned Alexei Kozia, Russia's most prestigious and expensive architect, to build a compound in one of Moscow's most exclusive areas, spending $8 million on its construction. According to the Unified State Register of Real Estate Rights, the land for the house is 64,000 square feet and was purchased in the name of Mrs. Anastasia Stepanova, Mr. Stepanov's 85-year-old pensioner mother. The land has a market value of $12,212,000, which is 3,914 years of his mother's official pension. The estate is located on the territory of a former Tsar's palace, the Arkhangelsk development, just off Rublovka Chaussee, the most expensive area in Moscow. On this land plot, the Stepanovs built an 11,900 square foot contemporary dream house. The main house is 8,600 square feet, has a wine cellar, gym, billiards room, sauna, and home cinema. In addition to this, there's a 3,200 square foot guest house and a 2-car garage. In order to keep a low profile and avoid unwanted questions, the new construction was never registered with the Moscow Region Land Registry. Officially, it doesn't exist, but it's so large, it's impossible to hide. Their new house was awarded the second best country house in Russia by the architectural competition Festival of Country Houses. The house, including its land, has an estimated market value of at least $20,212,000. The Stepanovs also began buying properties abroad. According to bank statements from Credit Suisse, 2 months after Mrs. Stepanova authorized the fraudulent refund, 10 down payments totaling $471,000 were made to purchase a beautiful seaside villa developed by the Montenegro Real Estate Development Group in the seaside village of Bar. Bank statements showed that the money used for this was in addition to the money in their offshore companies. According to records of the Russian Border Control Service, after the illegal tax refund, the Stepanovs traveled to Dubai 9 times and spent 95 days there. According to the official Dubai Property Registry, on September the 14th, 2008, Mr. Stepanov bought a beachfront villa on lot F48 of the Palm Jumeirah. Today, it's worth over $3 million. The 4,900 square foot villa, with views of the spectacular new Atlantis Resort, has 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, 574 square feet of balconies, and a 2-car garage. The floors are marble and the woods are mahogany. The villa sits on a land plot with a garden, a swimming pool, and its own beach. The Stepanov family also bought 2 luxury condominiums at the Kempinski Hotel and Residences Palm Jumeirah, extravagant in both design and address. The Kempinski is the showcase property on the Palm. and grants owners a world of exclusive luxury. Bank records from Credit Suisse confirm that down payments of $2.7 million were made for the Stepanovs' purchase of apartments 428 and 530. According to the Kempinski price list, the two apartments cost $4 million in total. Bank statements showed that the money used for this was in addition to the money in their offshore companies. After the fraudulent tax rebate of $230 million, the Stepanovs had a $20,212,000 Moscow countryside estate, a $700,000 beach house in Montenegro, a seaside villa and two luxury condominiums in Dubai worth $7 million, and the equivalent of $11 million in their offshore accounts. Total undeclared income of the Stepanovs, $38,900,000, or 1,013 years of their official declared income. The Stepanovs were not the only Russian tax officials getting rich. Meet Elena Anisimova, Mrs. Stepanova's first deputy at Tax Office number 28. According to records of Credit Suisse, immediately after authorizing the fraudulent refund, down payments of $852,908 were made to developer Emerald Palace Group Limited in her and her son Andrei's names to purchase a luxury two-bedroom condominium number G16 at the Kempinski Resort. Meet Mrs. Olga Sareva, another deputy of Mrs. Stepanova. According to records of Credit Suisse, immediately after authorizing the fraudulent refund, a down payment of $591,000 was sent on behalf of Mrs. Zareva and her daughter Elena as a down payment to purchase apartment 116 in the Kempinski Resort. According to the Kempinski Resort price list, each of these apartments costs $2 million. According to Credit Suisse records, these apartments were purchased from the same bank account used to pay for the Stepanovs' two apartments.
The $230 million fraudulent refund was not the first tax crime that Olga Stepanova and her subordinates at Tax Office 28 were involved in. Sergei found that Moscow tax offices 25 and 28 actually specialized in the business of making fraudulent tax refunds. Sergei Magnitsky found that in 2006, these two tax offices had made a $107 million fraudulent refund to the same small bank owned by the convicted criminal Dmitry Kluyev. As a matter of fact, Sergei found that in all of these cases, the companies were being moved specially to tax offices 25 and 28, which were friendly to making fraudulent refunds. According to Sergei's findings, almost $500 million was systematically stolen from the Russian government through these two tax offices from 2006 onwards. Sergei Magnitsky believed that officials who steal from their own government and their own people should be prosecuted. He wanted to see public money used for the education of children, for the care of the sick, for the care of the elderly. He wanted to see Russian public money used for the benefit of the Russian people.
Instead, Russian tax money was systematically stolen by corrupt tax officials, police officers, and organized criminals, and used to fund a life of unimaginable luxury. Instead of supporting Sergei Magnitsky and recognizing him as a hero, the government allowed Interior Ministry officers Kuznetsov, Karpov, Silchenko, and Vinogradova to arrest, torture, and kill him. In the year since Sergei Magnitsky's death, the investigative committee of the General Prosecutor's Office has refused to investigate officers Kuznetsov and Karpov's involvement in the theft and the source of their riches. It has refused to investigate how Oleg Silchenko and Natalia Vinogradova systematically tortured Sergei Magnitsky. The Ministry of the Interior has announced that the tax officers who received $43 million from the theft are honest and were tricked into making the refund. To add insult to injury, it is now trying to blame the crime on the brave and honest man who exposed the fraudulent refund and who identified officers Kuznetsov, Karpov, and the tax officials as key players in the fraud. Olga Stepanova and her colleagues use their positions to systematically steal tens of millions of dollars from the Russian people. They have the full support of officials in the Russian Interior Ministry, the prosecutor's office, and the FSB, whose officials aided them in these thefts and in covering them up, and they believe that this makes them untouchable. It is time to prove them wrong. Russia deserves better. Stop the untouchables. In previous episodes of Russian Untouchables, we showed you how Russian police officers and tax officials helped steal $230 million from the Russian government, and how Sergei Magnitsky exposed them and ended up dead. Today, we're going to show you who murdered Sergei Magnitsky. Most of the information in this movie was gathered by Sergei Magnitsky himself shortly before his files were taken, and he was arrested by the same officers he testified against.
Sergei Magnitsky traced the $230 million tax theft to an organized crime group headed by a 44-year-old convicted criminal, Dmitry Kluyev. In 2008, Sergei Magnitsky decided to document the group's crimes and expose it. He didn't realize that he was about to expose the crimes of the Russian government itself. Sergei Magnitsky learned that 13 years ago, Dmitry Kluyev, the head of the organized crime group, was just a petty criminal. He first shows up in police records on the 3rd of June, 1998, when he was arrested after beating a man he caught leaving the apartment of his girlfriend. Within 5 years, Kluyev had become an important organized crime figure. On March 16, 2003, just as he and his wife were leaving the Starlight Diner in Moscow, a professional assassin waiting in the car park tried to kill them with a 6.35mm pistol. Kluyev's bodyguard was shot in the stomach and was seriously injured, but Kluyev and his wife escaped unharmed.
However, it was Kluyev's financial schemes that most interested Sergei Magnitsky. He found court documents showing that in 2002, the president of the Moscow investment bank Renaissance Capital, Igor Sagirian, brought in Kluyev to obtain a massive tax refund. This information came from the testimony of another Renaissance Capital executive, Yuri Saigodak, former general of the KGB. The modus operandi described in the documents was exactly the same as used 5 years later to steal $230 million of taxes paid by the Hermitage Fund.
Sergei Magnitsky then discovered a crime which, combined with newly discovered travel records, proves the collaboration between Interior Ministry officers and organized criminals. In December of 2004, Dmitry Kluyev and his lawyer Andrei Pavlov attempted to steal $1.6 billion worth of shares in the iron ore company Mikhailovsky Gok.
A criminal case was launched against the Kluyev crime group. The investigation into the crime was headed by Interior Ministry officer Major Pavel Karpov. Karpov questioned many witnesses, all of whom identified Kluyev as the mastermind. However, in an unusual development in a criminal case, 4 months before the final verdict, Major Pavel Karpov, the main investigator, and Dmitry Kluyev, the main suspect, went on vacation together. Records from the Russian Border Control Service show that on the 5th of April 2006, they flew together to Larnaca, Cyprus, where they spent 3 days on vacation.
After returning from Cyprus, instead of Major Karpov indicting Kluyev as the mastermind of the fraud, he named Sergei Albayev, Kluyev's driver, as the person mostly responsible for this complex $1.6 billion fraud. But Albayev couldn't challenge this conclusion because he was found dead in the Rostov region, about 1,000 kilometers south of Moscow. According to the official autopsy, he died of heart failure.
Karpov also named another low-level member of the Kluyev crime group, Alexei Alexanov, as another key player in the crime. But again, before Alexanov had the opportunity to defend himself, he also mysteriously died of heart failure before the trial. Karpov never indicted Kluyev's partner, attorney Andrei Pavlov, who prepared all the fraudulent documents. And most importantly, Major Karpov fixed the investigation results so Kluyev could avoid prison. Kluyev was only given a suspended sentence thanks to Major Karpov's work. With Major Karpov now a key member, the Kluyev group became bolder. Using law enforcement to blame innocent or dead people for crimes became the group's modus operandi, and it expanded its operations to include extortion and kidnapping.
On August 16th of 2006, Major Pavel Karpov and Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Kuznetsov arranged the arrest of Fyodor Mikheyev, a Moscow fertilizer executive. Initially, they held him at Petrovka 38, Moscow police headquarters. Then, according to court testimony, Kluyev asked his main enforcer, Sergei Orlov, to physically take Mr. Mikheyev from the officers and drive him 48 kilometers outside of Moscow to a country house. At the country house, Mr. Mikheyev was held hostage by a convicted killer, Viktor Markelov.
While Markelov and Orlov held him, they demanded a $20 million ransom from Mr. Mikheyev's boss. Mr. Mikheyev testified,
Sergei Orlov and Viktor Markelov periodically reminded me that in case I tried to escape, not only would I suffer, but my relatives and family as well.
Ekaterina, Mr. Mikheyev's wife, testified that the kidnappers threatened to gang rape her if she went to the authorities for help.
Would you like it if you were taken into a country house with many drunken men who would then rape you in a circle?
Despite these ominous threats, Mrs. Mikheyev appealed to a different branch of the police. And on August 28th of 2006, a dozen heavily armed troops from the Federal Anti-Kidnapping Task Force stormed the house at about 3 p.m. They freed Mr. Mikheyev, they arrested Orlov and Markelov, and they opened a criminal case against officers Kuznetsov and Karpov, and they began to question Kluyev.
Once again, corrupt Interior Ministry officers fixed their problem. The investigation of Karpov and Kuznetsov and the questioning of Kluyev was dropped. Orlov and Markelov were freed, and Mr. Mikheyev was rearrested and sent to prison for 11 years, where he sits to this day. Sergei Magnitsky's most important discovery, and the one that cost him his life, was uncovering the Ren gas tax fraud. 6 months after the Mikheyev kidnapping, Kluyev and Pavlov organized the theft of $107 million of taxes paid by Rengas, affiliates of Renaissance Capital, one of the largest and most important investment banks in Russia. This was the same company whose president, Igor Sagirian, brought in Kluyev in 2002 to arrange tax refunds through the court system. Kluyev's attorney, Pavlov, working together with the heads of Moscow tax offices 28 and 25, organized a fraudulent tax refund of $107 million, paid by the two Renaissance Capital affiliates. The money was wired to accounts in the Universal Savings Bank, which was proven in court to be owned and controlled by Dmitry Kluyev. Shortly after receiving the fraudulent tax refund, Kluyev, who owned the bank that received the stolen $107 million, along with Olga Stepanova, head of Tax Office 28, who refunded the money, and Stepanova's husband, Vladlen, went on vacation to Dubai. They then traveled to Switzerland, where the Stepanovs held secret accounts with Credit Suisse. And on the 16th of January, Kluyev and the Stepanovs flew from Geneva to Moscow together on the same flight. Meanwhile, Interior Ministry officer Karpov, together with Kluyev's lawyers, Pavlov and his wife, who prepared all the court documents for the illegal tax refund, flew to London on the same flight and spent 5 days enjoying the sights and shopping for New Year's gifts. In Pavlov's wife's visa application, she confirmed to the UK Border Service that she and her husband Pavlov were travelling together with Major Karpov of the Interior Ministry.
After the return from their respective vacations, the Kluyev criminal group planned its next and largest crime, the theft of taxes paid by Hermitage Fund, the largest investment firm in Russia.
To plan this, the Kluyev group invited all the key players to meetings in Cyprus. According to the manifest of Kluyev's private jet, on April the 28th, 2007, Kluyev, along with Interior Ministry officer Artyom Kuznetsov, flew to Larnaca on Kluyev's private jet. Two days later, Interior Ministry officer Karpov flew together with Kluyev's deputy Pavlov and his wife on Aeroflot 487 to Larnaca. Finally, the head of Tax Office 28 and her husband flew on Aeroflot 237 to Larnaca. At the Cyprus meeting, Kluyev assigned the tasks that each member of the group would play in what would become the largest tax refund fraud in Russian history.
One month later, early in the morning of June 4th, 2007, Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Kuznetsov led a team of 25 officers and raided the offices of Hermitage Fund and its lawyers. He took the documents for the Hermitage Fund companies and their seals, and he handed these to Major Pavel Karpov.
The documents were then used to fraudulently re-register 3 Hermitage companies into the name of Viktor Markelov, the same man who had kidnapped Fyodor Mikheyev with the same police officers 13 months earlier. Once again, they moved the companies to Tax Office 28, run by Olga Stepanova, and opened accounts for the companies at Kluyev's Universal Savings Bank. While this was going on, Kluyev's lawyer Pavlov did exactly the same thing as he had in the Rengas fraud a year earlier. The same lawyer used the same courts and the same plaintiffs and the same forged documents word for word in order to obtain judgments for huge debts that did not exist.
On the 24th of December, the Kluyev Group submitted a fraudulent tax refund request to Olga Stepanova and her colleagues for $230 million, the largest fraudulent tax refund in Russian history. It was granted on the same day with no questions asked, and once again it was paid directly to accounts at Kluyev's Universal Savings Bank.
Once again, the criminals and police officers celebrated by going on vacation together. On New Year's Day 2008, right after the $230 million had been wired to Kluyev's bank, Major Karpov and attorneys Pavlov and his wife flew to Istanbul and returned to Moscow together 4 days later. Shortly after, attorneys Pavlov and his wife flew to Dubai to join tax officer Stepanova, her husband, and Kluyev. 1 week later, the tax officers began spending their share of the stolen government money on Dubai properties. Credit Suisse bank statements show that Vladlen Stepanov, husband of Olga Stepanova, who approved the refund along with 2 of Stepanova's subordinates from Tax Office 28, made 4 down payments from the same Swiss bank account to purchase $8 million of properties at the Kempinski Hotel and Residences, Palm Jumeirah in Dubai.
In October of 2008, Sergei Magnitsky gave an interview to the Moscow bureau chief of Business Week magazine. He showed that all the tax thefts had been committed by the same people, and that the Kluyev criminal group had been systematically stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the Russian government for years. He then testified against all the police officers involved.
After the Business Week story was published, tax officer Stepanova and her husband panicked and fled Russia to Dubai. Shortly thereafter, on November the 20th, Igor Sagirian, the president of Renaissance Capital, who brought in Kluyev to do tax refunds for Renaissance, also flew to Dubai. He was accompanied by Vladimir Jabarov, another Renaissance manager, formerly the Lieutenant General of the FSB, the Russian secret police. 3 days later, the Stepanovs apparently believed that an effective cover-up plan was in place, and they returned to Moscow with Sagirian on the same flight. They crossed passport control one after another. The very next day, Officer Kuznetsov sent his subordinates to arrest Sergei Magnitsky and confiscate the Magnitsky files. Once Sergei Magnitsky was in custody, they started to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. The criminals then began protecting the key members of the group. At first, the Interior Ministry blamed the entire sophisticated tax fraud on Viktor Markelov, the convicted murderer and former sawmill foreman. When the media didn't buy this story, they blamed another low-level ex-con who had participated in the crime, Valery Korochkin. But he couldn't be questioned about the organizers because in 2008 he was found dead in Borispol, Ukraine. He was 43 years old. Then, they named a 53-year-old security guard, Oktay Gosanov, as the mastermind of the crime. This story also backfired for the Kluyev Group because Gasanov had died 2 months before the money was stolen from the government. At this point, the press began reporting that Kluyev was the organizer behind the theft and that he owned Universal Savings Bank, which received all the stolen money. The Interior Ministry then announced that just before the stolen money was transferred to the bank, Kluyev sold the bank to a 55-year-old clothing salesman, Mr. Semyon Korobeinikov. Mr. Korobeinikov could also not be questioned because he died falling off a balcony in 2008. The Interior Ministry then exonerated all the tax officials, concluding that they were innocent and tricked into making the refunds. This was despite the fact that the tax officials had acquired $43 million at the time of the refund and were vacationing with the man who owned the bank that received all the money. Then the Interior Ministry announced the stolen money could not be traced because the truck carrying all the records of Universal Savings Bank exploded in central Moscow.
The one problem that the Interior Ministry had was that Sergei Magnitsky would not be silenced. On October 14th of 2009, from pretrial detention, Sergei Magnitsky again testified against the Kluyev criminal group.
4 weeks later, on November the 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky was found dead on the floor of an isolation cell. He had been handcuffed and beaten to death by 8 riot guards with rubber batons, the handcuffs lacerating his wrists as he struggled to survive. The official cause of death, heart failure, with no signs of violence. 1 year after they murdered Sergei Magnitsky for exposing their crimes, the Interior Ministry blamed him for the same $230 million theft that he tried to prevent. In the spring of 2012, the independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta, along with the Financial Times, revealed that after the arrest and murder of Sergei Magnitsky, the Kluyev criminal group received an additional $400 million in fraudulent refunds, authorized by the same Tax Office 28 and laundered through a new bank registered at the same address as the Universal Savings Bank. This one criminal group has stolen $800 million from the Russian people, and everybody at the highest levels of the Russian government knows which officials are involved. When Sergei Magnitsky decided to expose the Kluyev criminal group, he believed that he'd found a pocket of corruption inside the Russian government. He never could have imagined that organized crime had become so intertwined with the Russian government that there was no longer any difference between the two. It's time to stop the untouchables. Russia deserves better.